Woo-Jin Oh was not a man who checked his watch. He owned 3 of them, all Swiss, all obscenely expensive, but time had never been something he tracked with anxiety. Time moved around him, not the other way. Meetings started when he arrived. Deals closed when he decided. The entire machinery of his organization operated on the simple principle that Woo-Jin Oh did not wait for anything. Yet there he sat, leather chair, black shirt with sleeves rolled to the forearm, the city skyline burning gold and blue behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, and he had looked at his watch 4 times in the last 3 minutes. The whiskey on the table beside him had gone warm. He hadn't touched it. He turned the folded note between his fingers again. He'd read it already. He'd read it 6 times, in fact, which was 5 more times than it required, because the message was not complicated. 7 words, written in Kaima's careful, unhurried handwriting on the small notepad she kept beside the kitchen telephone. I'd like to request a week off. In the background, near the penthouse entrance, she stood waiting for his answer, beige coat, small suitcase, phone in hand. She wasn't demanding. She wasn't emotional. She simply waited with the particular patience of a woman who had learned that the world rarely gave her things on the first ask, and sometimes not on the second either. The physical distance between them, 30 feet of polished floor, warm lamplight, the quiet hum of the city 60 stories below, felt, in this moment, like something considerably wider. Woo-Jin had negotiated with cartel representatives across a table in Mexico City. He had sat unmoved through federal surveillance disclosures, through the news of his father's assassination, through the kind of threats that made other men in his position simply disappear. His composure was not performed. It was structural, built over 12 years of understanding that the moment you showed what mattered to you, someone would use it. And now he was sitting here, a folded piece of notepaper between his fingers, unable to say a single word. Because the note wasn't the problem. The problem was the feeling that preceded it, the one he'd been refusing to name since the 3rd month, maybe the 2nd, the feeling that arrived sharp and uninvited every time he heard her footsteps in the hallway before she entered a room, or noticed the 2nd cup of tea she left at the far end of the kitchen counter where he would find it without either of them having to acknowledge that it was placed there with intention. He had no business feeling any of it. He had a rule. One rule, held without exception since he was 21 years old and learned in the worst possible way that attachment is not love, it is leverage, waiting to be found by the wrong person. Yet here was the note. And there was the suitcase. And Woo-Jin Oh, feared from Manhattan to Seoul, a man whose name ended conversations in rooms he wasn't even in, could not bring himself to simply say approved and return to work. You know that silence. The kind that fills up a room when someone finally asks the question you've been dreading without knowing you were dreading it. That's where this story lives. If you want to find out what happens when the most guarded man in the room finally runs out of ways to pretend he doesn't care, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what comes next will stay with you. 8 months earlier, Kaima Evans had been a completely different person. Evans. The attending physician's voice carried across the nursing station without effort. Your post-op patient in 412 is asking for you specifically. 3rd time this shift. A pause, eyebrow raised. What exactly are you doing in there? Kaima looked up from her charting, the ghost of a smile on her face. Talking to him. About what? His grandchildren. His garden. The 86 Mets. She capped her pen. He's scared and he's alone and nobody's explained his discharge plan to him in language he can actually understand. She stood, smoothing her scrubs. I'll go. The attending watched her walk away and said nothing, because there was nothing to argue with. This was her last clinical rotation before her final semester. 18 months from her RN. Her advisor had already flagged her for a critical care track recommendation. Her mother had a photograph of her in her white coat on the refrigerator at home in Savannah, held up by a magnet shaped like a peach, next to a handwritten note in her mother's script, "My daughter, the nurse." Present tense, not future. Her mother had always been certain about this particular thing. Room 412 was at the end of the hall. Kaima pushed open the door with her shoulder, chart in hand, already speaking before she'd fully entered the room. "Mr. Okafor. I heard you've been asking for me." The old man's face arranged itself into something between relief and mild affront. "Took you long enough. I had other patients. They don't need you like I do. Nobody needs me like you do," she said, pulling the chair to his bedside with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Now, you were telling me about your tomatoes." Outside, through the hospital window, Manhattan moved through itself in the dark, indifferent, enormous, and full of things that were coming for her that she could not yet see. But futures, as Kaima Evans was about to learn, have a way of arriving ahead of schedule. The call came on a Thursday. Not from the hospital. From Savannah. And everything she had been building, the degree, the track, the photograph on her mother's refrigerator, began, quietly and without ceremony, to come apart. The call came on a Thursday, between a double shift and a study session she'd been looking forward to all week, the kind of small, private pleasure that sustained her through the hard stretches. She had her highlighters organized by subject. She had a thermos of chamomile. She had 4 hours before she needed to sleep. Her phone rang and she answered it without looking at the screen, the way you do when you're not yet afraid of what a phone call can be. Her Aunt Rosie's voice came through first, not the words, just the register of it. The particular tone that women in her family used when they were holding themselves together specifically so the person on the other end didn't have to. Kaima had heard it once before, when her father left. She recognized it immediately, and sat down on the edge of her bed before a single sentence had been completed. Stage 3. Her mother. The kind that moves quickly. She stayed on the phone for 40 minutes. She said the right things. "I'll be there, don't worry, we'll figure it out." And when she hung up, she sat for a long time in the quiet of her apartment with the highlighters still organized in front of her, and the thermos still steaming, and did not reach for either. She called the registrar's office the following Monday. The woman on the phone was kind, which somehow made it worse. "A leave of absence is absolutely an option. Take all the time you need." Kaima thanked her and ended the call and wrote down the reinstatement deadlines in her planner in careful, even letters, as if the act of writing them made them real and reachable and not simply a thing she was doing to survive the conversation. Financial aid was less kind. The figures involved were clear and cold, and non-negotiable. She drove to Savannah that weekend with 2 suitcases. She told herself it was temporary. She was careful about that word, temporary, the way you are careful with something fragile, holding it gently, not examining it too closely in case it turned out to be less sturdy than you needed it to be. Her mother was smaller than she expected. That was the first thing. Not dramatically smaller, not in a way that announced itself, just slightly, subtly less than she had been the last time Kaima saw her, as if something had been quietly borrowing from her without permission. She hugged Kaima in the hospital doorway and said, "You didn't have to come," and Kaima said, "I know," because it was easier than arguing, and they both understood what the visit actually meant. She stayed for 6 weeks. She learned her mother's medication schedule the way she had learned clinical procedures, methodically, completely, with a part of her brain that did not panic. She spoke to the oncologist with the focused attention of someone who had spent 2 years learning how to listen to doctors, and the oncologist seemed to recognize this and spoke to her accordingly, which she was grateful for even when the information was hard. When she returned to New York, her mother's credit card debt and the first round of treatment costs had between them consumed everything Kaima had saved in 3 years of working through school. The storage unit on 145th Street held her nursing textbooks, her clinical reference materials, a box of notes in her own handwriting, and the white coat with her name embroidered above the breast pocket in navy thread. She locked the unit, pocketed the key, and did not go back. Obsidian was not the kind of place that advertised. You heard about it the way you heard about all things in that stratum of the city, through someone who knew someone, a name passed quietly between people who understood that discretion was not merely preferred but structurally required. The salary was real. The hours were manageable. The only qualification, as far as Kaima could determine, was the ability to move through a room full of dangerous men without registering fear. She had that. She had always had that. Her first shift began at 9 on a Friday evening. Heels she'd bought second-hand for $12, hair pinned with the precision she'd once reserved for clinical presentations. The interior of Obsidian was all dark wood and low amber light, the kind of space that swallowed sound and returned it in murmurs. She had been briefed by the floor manager in 17 minutes, names she would not use, orders she would not question, observations she would not repeat. She had nodded through all of it. The room was full when she entered with her first tray. Suits. Korean mostly, some not. Men who spoke in the particular register of people accustomed to rooms clearing for them. They did not look at her. She had learned long ago how to use that. The way invisibility, if you understood it correctly, was not diminishment but information. You learned a great deal about people when they forgot you were present. She moved through the room with the quiet efficiency she had brought to every hard thing in her life. Tray steady. Eyes forward. The particular composure of a woman who has learned that falling apart is a luxury, and she has never been able to afford luxury. She was halfway through her second pass of the room when she felt it, the specific weight of being watched by someone who was not pretending otherwise. She did not turn immediately. She finished her route, delivered the last 2 glasses, and returned to the service corridor before she allowed herself to look back through the narrow rectangular window in the door. In the far corner, at a table occupied by 3 other men who were speaking at length, one man was not speaking at all. He was watching her. Dark eyes. Sleeves rolled once at the cuff. A stillness about him that was not boredom, something more deliberate than that. The kind of stillness that meant he was doing exactly what he intended to do, and intended to keep doing it. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she turned and walked back to the kitchen, her expression giving away nothing, the way it had been trained, by circumstance and loss and 2 years of watching people receive terrible news, to give away absolutely nothing at all. Woo-Jin Oh had built his life around the principle of justified action. Every decision traceable to a reason. Every expenditure of attention accountable to a purpose. It was not discipline in the way most people use that word, as something imposed from outside, a constraint applied to impulse. For Woo-Jin it was structural, the load-bearing wall of everything he had constructed since 21, when he learned in a single night that the things you loved were not yours to protect. His father had loved openly. Had trusted freely. Had believed, until the last possible moment, that the relationships he'd built over 30 years of careful, principled leadership in the organization would hold against the ambition of one man who had decided they shouldn't. They hadn't held. His father had been buried on a Tuesday in Seoul in a closed casket, and Woo-Jin had stood at the grave in a suit that didn't fit because he hadn't owned one that did, and made a decision so quietly it barely registered as a decision at all. Nothing that matters becomes visible. Nothing visible becomes a target. He had governed by it without exception for 12 years. The penthouse was deliberately impersonal, beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, but bearing no trace of preference, no evidence of a self that could be read and used. The men who came to him came on his schedule, sat where he indicated, left when he was finished. His organization ran with the particular efficiency of a system whose components understood that questions were not part of their function. He visited Obsidian on the first Friday of each month. It was useful, the kind of room where information moved freely between men who believed the low lighting made them indiscreet, and Woo-Jin had always found other people's carelessness professionally valuable. He had a regular table. He ordered the same thing. He stayed 2 hours and left without ceremony. He noticed her on the 3rd visit after she started. Not immediately. He was midway through a conversation with his second, Park Sung-il, about a supply chain discrepancy that required resolution before the following week. But something in his peripheral vision registered an anomaly, and his mind, trained to process anomalies without interrupting its primary function, filed it quietly and returned to the conversation. It retrieved the filing on the drive home. The anomaly was not what she looked like. It was how she moved. There was an economy to it, nothing wasted, nothing performed, the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to measure expenditure carefully because they had never had the luxury of excess. He had seen that quality in exactly two categories of people in his life: soldiers and survivors. She was neither, as far as he could observe. She was carrying a tray through a room of men who were paid to notice threats, and not one of them had looked at her twice. He noticed her again the following month. And the month after that. On the third occasion he watched her for 11 minutes without any operational justification he could name, which was 10 minutes and 50 seconds longer than he was comfortable with. She managed a spilled glass at the table nearest the east wall, a guest's fault, not hers, with a composure so complete that the man responsible seemed more unsettled by the incident than she did. She said something quiet. The man actually apologized. She moved on. Woo-Jin returned to his own table and told himself the interest was categorically professional. Obsidian was his environment. The people who moved through it were, by extension, relevant to understand. He called his assistant the following morning. The waitress at Obsidian. Black woman, late 20s, hair up. Friday evenings. A pause. I want a file. His assistant did not ask why. That was the job's primary qualification. The file arrived in 48 hours. He read it at his desk in the penthouse, city gray and overcast beyond the glass, coffee untouched beside him. Kaima Afia Evans, 26. Born in Savannah, Georgia. Mother, Diane Evans, currently undergoing treatment for stage 3 breast cancer at a facility in Midtown. A facility, he noted, that was adequate but not optimal. Father, absent since Kaima was 9. No siblings. Academic record that stopped 18 months short of an RN with a notation that said leave of absence, personal circumstances, which was the institutional language for something broke and she couldn't stop it from breaking. He read the financial summary. He read it again. Then he closed the file. He opened it again 20 minutes later and sat with the medical section for longer than was necessary given that he was not her physician, her family, or her employer. He was a man who had requested a background check for professional reasons and was now reading about her mother's treatment protocol, which was not information he needed for any purpose he could justify in the language he normally used to justify things. He closed the file again. He stood at the window for a while with his hands in his pockets, watching the city do what cities do at 7 in the morning, resume, mechanically, without sentiment, and examined the feeling he was having with the detached clinical attention he brought to anything that presented as a potential vulnerability. The feeling did not resolve into anything manageable. He picked up his phone. The Evans file. His assistant answered on the first ring. I want you to arrange an offer. Live-in household position, the penthouse. Competitive salary, generous competitive, not standard. He paused. Use the intermediary we used for the last placement. She doesn't need to know the source until she arrives. Understood. Reason for approach, if she asks? Woo-Jin considered this for a moment. Tell her we were referred by someone who recognized her quality. He set the phone down before any follow-up question could form. He returned to the window. Below him, the city continued its indifferent machinery. He watched it without seeing it, his thumb moving once, almost absently, across the face of his watch. The gesture of a man tracking something. Though he could not yet have said precisely what. The offer arrived on a Wednesday through a woman named Mrs. Lim, who called from a number with no listed name and spoke with the measured efficiency of someone who handled arrangements professionally and had long since stopped finding them remarkable. Live-in household manager. Private residence, Manhattan. The salary she quoted was not a misprint. Kaima wrote it down anyway, said she would consider it, and spent the following 40 minutes on the phone with the billing coordinator at her mother's treatment facility, who walked her through the projected costs of the next cycle with the particular gentleness of someone who delivered bad news in small, carefully portioned increments. When the call ended, Kaima looked at the number she had written down and then at the figure the billing coordinator had left her with, and did not require very long to resolve the arithmetic. She called Mrs. Lim back before the hour was out. The concerns did not disappear because the decision was made, they simply became less relevant than the alternative. The vague language in Mrs. Lim's description of the role. The salary that did not correspond to the stated duties. The requirement for discretion framed not as a preference but as a structural condition of employment. Any version of Kaima Evans from 2 years ago would have recognized these as the grammar of a situation worth walking away from. This version set her concerns in a neat row, acknowledged them, and got on the subway to meet the intermediary at a midtown office with no company name on the door, and walls that said nothing about the person who had paid for them. She signed where indicated. She was given an address and a start date, and a key card and told to bring what she wished to keep. The rest, Mrs. Lim said, could be acquired. She gave notice at Obsidian that Friday. The floor manager looked at her for a moment as if he wanted to ask a question, then decided against it. She collected her final pay, said goodbye to the 2 women she had worked alongside long enough to know their coffee orders, and took the train back to her apartment to pack 2 suitcases and make a decision about what she needed versus what she simply owned. The storage unit on 145th Street stayed locked. The penthouse was on the 61st floor of a building that did not announce itself from the street. No logo above the entrance, no ostentatious canopy, just a doorman who knew her name before she gave it, and a private elevator that required her key card and ascended without music. The doors opened on marble. Indirect lighting. A silence so complete it had a texture, not empty, but deliberate, the kind engineered by someone who understood that noise was a form of vulnerability. The city lay behind floor-to-ceiling glass like a painting commissioned to remind you of something, though Kaima was not immediately certain what. She stood in the foyer with her 2 suitcases and understood, in the unhurried way she processed most things, that she had entered a world with its own specific set of rules, and that learning them quickly would matter. "Miss Evans." He came from the far end of the room. She had not heard a door open. He moved with the quiet of someone who had never needed to announce himself because rooms rearranged themselves around his presence without requiring instruction. He was taller than she had registered across the length of Obsidian. The tattoo that had been partially visible at his cuff climbed further up his forearm than she'd realized. He wore no jacket. He looked, she thought, like a man in his own home, which was either obvious or significant depending on how much you believed that powerful people ever truly relaxed. He did not extend his hand. He studied her for a moment with eyes that were doing something more precise than looking, and then he spoke. "I have one rule." He said it without preface, without apology. "The East Wing, the corridor past the second set of doors, does not exist for you. You do not enter it, approach it, or acknowledge its existence to anyone." A pause, brief and absolute. "Everything else will be in your daily brief. Mrs. Lim has prepared your quarters. They're in the West Wing." He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to trust, then turned and walked back the way he'd come. Kaima watched him go. Then she picked up her suitcases and found the West Wing. The quarters were not what she had expected, which meant they were considerably better. A sitting room. A bedroom with windows that faced north over the city. A bathroom with the kind of fixtures that signaled expenditure without requiring it to be discussed. A small writing desk positioned near the window, which she suspected was not accidental and chose not to examine too closely. She unpacked with the systematic efficiency she brought to every unfamiliar environment, clothes first, then toiletries, then the small framed photograph of her mother that went on the nightstand in every place she slept. Last, from the inner pocket of her bag, the storage unit key, which she placed in the desk drawer face down. She sat on the edge of the bed and said to the quiet room, in the voice she used when she was being honest with herself, "This is temporary." She would do the work well because she did all work well. She would learn the rules because rules in places like this existed for reasons. She would save what she earned and return to Savannah when her mother needed her and return to the storage unit when her mother was better and retrieve the white coat and the textbooks and resume the plan. Temporary. Down the hall, in the room whose existence she had already been instructed to forget, Woo-Jin sat at his desk in the blue light of his monitor. The security feed from the West Wing corridor was open in the lower left corner of his screen, a small, unremarkable window displaying an empty hallway. He was not watching it. But he had not closed it either. The first thing she learned was the tea. Not the brand, that was in the brief Mrs. Lim had prepared, a 2-page document of impressive specificity that covered everything from preferred dry cleaning turnaround to the particular filing system in which his reading materials were organized. The brief told her what. It took her approximately 3 weeks to learn the how, which mattered more and was not something any document could convey. The temperature had a window of roughly 4 minutes. Too early and it was aggressive, the kind of heat that overwhelmed the flavor and left something flat at the back of the palate. Too late and something closed in it, a subtle contraction that she doubted most people would detect. She detected it on day 4 by watching his hand rest beside the cup without lifting it, a pause so brief it would have registered to anyone else as nothing at all. She adjusted the timing by 90 seconds. On day 5 his hand lifted without hesitation. He said nothing. She noted it. The documents on his desk had a system that preceded her and would likely outlast her, but within that system there was a preference she identified in the second week. The way he moved certain folders to his left when he was finished with them versus setting them aside when he intended to return. She began anticipating the distinction. He arrived one morning to find his active materials already separated from the completed ones with the precision of someone who had been watching him work for years. He stood at his desk for a moment looking at the arrangement. Then he sat down and began without comment. She noted that too. What she could not anticipate, and did not try to, was the silence requirement. The brief had said nothing about it. She discovered it by accident on a Thursday when she turned on the kitchen radio to a low murmur while preparing his morning tray, something unobtrusive and ambient, and heard him pause in the hallway outside in a way that was not quite a stop but was longer than a step. She turned it off. The footsteps resumed. Complete silence, she discovered the following week, was also wrong. Too much of it seemed to press on something in him, produced a particular quality of stillness that she had learned to distinguish from his ordinary stillness, tighter, less inhabited. She began running water in the kitchen at low pressure during his working hours. The sound traveled just enough. The quality of his stillness changed back. She did not congratulate herself for these observations. She filed them the way she had once filed clinical data, neutrally, usefully, without attachment to what they might mean about her reasons for collecting them. The morning stretches happened at 6:15, in the narrow space between her bed and the north-facing window. She had done them since nursing school, 20 minutes of deliberate movement that belonged entirely to her, a small daily insistence that her body was still her own. She had no reason to think anyone observed them. She discovered otherwise on a Tuesday in the 3rd month, when she passed the corridor near the east wing and caught, at an angle she was not meant to have, the blue-lit edge of a monitor through a door that had not fully closed. The image on the lower portion of the screen was small and unmistakable. Her hallway. Her window. The time stamp read 6:17. She walked past without breaking stride. She went back to her quarters and sat with this information for a while, turning it with the careful, non-reactive attention she gave to things that required understanding before response. He was not, she had come to understand over 3 months of proximity, a man who watched for the reasons most men watched. There was no predation in his stillness. What she had seen on his face in obsidian, and had been quietly confirming ever since, was something else, a kind of attention that did not take, but registered. The difference was not small. She said nothing. She continued her stretches at 6:15. She did not examine too closely why she continued to face the window. The second cup of tea began without intention. She had made a surplus one morning, distraction, miscalculation, and rather than discard it, placed it at the far end of the kitchen counter before carrying his tray to the study. When she returned 20 minutes later it was gone, and the counter had been wiped clean, and nothing in the penthouse indicated that any of this had occurred. She made the surplus again the following morning, and the one after that. At some point, she could not have said precisely when, it stopped being surplus and became the second cup, placed at 9:47 at the far left edge of the counter, at the exact periphery of where he would naturally look when he passed through to refill his water. She never saw him take it. She never acknowledged placing it. The counter was always clean when she returned. This was, she understood, a language. Not one either of them had agreed to speak, more like something they had both discovered they already knew. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning in the 4th month, left on the kitchen counter where her daily brief usually sat. Inside was a card, performance bonus, with acknowledgement of exceptional service, and beneath the card, a bracelet. Jade, small carved beads on a fine gold chain, the kind of piece that was simple enough to be worn daily and specific enough that it could not have been chosen without thought. She read the card twice. She placed the card in her desk drawer and put the bracelet on. At 6:30, when Woo-Jin came through the kitchen for his tea, his eyes moved once, briefly, to her wrist. Then to his cup. He lifted it with his usual unhurried precision, and whatever he saw in his face in the window's reflection when he turned away, she chose, for reasons that were becoming harder to fully account for, not to name. She turned back to her work. The bracelet caught the morning light and said nothing, the way the most significant things between them had learned, very efficiently, to say nothing at all. She wrote it the night before. Not because the words were difficult, 7 words did not require drafting, but because the act of asking required a kind of preparation she had not needed in 8 months of employment. She had made no personal requests. She had taken no personal days. She had existed in this penthouse with the deliberate self-sufficiency of someone who understood that needing things from people in positions of power was a transaction with terms that were rarely in your favor. But her mother had called on Sunday. The voice on the phone was the same voice it had always been, patient, warm, with the particular cadence of a woman who had raised a daughter alone and considered cheerfulness a form of love. It was also smaller than it had been in September. Smaller than it had been in November. Kaima had sat on the edge of her bed and listened to her mother describe the view from the hospital room window. "The magnolia is coming back, baby, you should see it," and felt something in her chest pull tight and stay there. She needed to go to Savannah. She found the notepad beside the kitchen telephone, the one she used for household communications, and wrote in her ordinary handwriting, "I'd like to request a week off." She read it back. 7 words, plain and direct, the way she had learned to communicate in this household where plainness was respected and performance was not. She folded it once and set it beside where his tea would be in the morning, beneath the small dish where she left his daily brief. Then she went to bed and did not sleep particularly well, which she attributed to the coffee she'd had at 7 and not to anything else. Woo-Jin came through the kitchen at 6:30, as he always did. He saw the note before he saw the brief. Something in the placement of it, slightly off-center, folded rather than flat, registered as a deviation before he had consciously processed what it was. He picked it up. He read it. He set it down with the same measured precision he set everything down, poured his tea, and carried both the cup and the note to the kitchen island where he stood and read it again. 7 words. Handwriting he had become, without intending to, familiar with. He set the note down a second time and drank his tea. At 8:50 his assistant called to confirm the 9 o'clock. Woo-Jin looked at the note. "Push it," he said. "An hour." He ended the call before the follow-up question could form, which was efficient, because he did not have an answer for why he was pushing a call he had requested himself in order to stand in his kitchen reading a 7-word note for the 3rd time. The 11 o'clock was a sit-down with 2 men who had traveled from Chicago specifically for the meeting and would require rescheduling through channels that would not appreciate the inconvenience. He rescheduled it anyway, briefly, without explanation, the way he did things that he had decided to do and had no interest in justifying. He poured a second cup of tea. He did not drink it. The note was a reasonable request. It was, in the objective language of employment, entirely unremarkable. A person asking for 7 days of personal leave after 8 months of work that had been, by any measurable standard, exceptional. There was nothing in it that warranted the amount of attention he was currently giving it. He understood this. He stood at the kitchen island and understood it clearly, and continued to read the note. The thing that occupied him was not the request. It was the blank space the request had illuminated, the sudden, unwelcome awareness of a gap he had not known was there until the possibility of it had been introduced. He thought about the second cup of tea at 9:47. The 6:15 window. The way the penthouse had a quality in the evenings now that it had not had before she arrived, something he had never named because naming it would have required admitting he had noticed it, and admitting he had noticed it would have required examining why. A week. 7 days. The penthouse would run. His contingency staff was competent. Nothing would be functionally different. He picked up the note one more time. His assistant appeared in the kitchen doorway at noon with the expression of a person who had been told not to interrupt and was interrupting anyway because the interruption had become medically necessary. He looked at his employer, still at the island, tea cold, the 11 o'clock rescheduled, the 9 o'clock still not completed, and said nothing, which was the most professionally sophisticated thing he had done all year. Woo-Jin looked up. Looked at the cold tea. Set the note down with a finality that was mostly performance. He took out his phone. He found Kaima's contact, listed under the household staff, between the dry cleaner and the building maintenance line, where it had always been and where it now seemed, for reasons he did not pursue, entirely inadequate. He typed 2 words. Of course. He put the phone in his pocket. He told his assistant to reschedule the Chicago meeting for Thursday, and resumed the 9 o'clock at 2. He moved to his desk and opened his laptop and spent the remainder of the afternoon working with the focused, almost aggressive productivity of a man who had something to outpace. He reviewed 3 contracts. He approved a supply chain amendment. He read a 17-page operational summary, and retained all of it. At 6:15 the following morning, he passed the kitchen on his way to his office and stopped for precisely 3 seconds in front of the counter where the second cup of tea was always waiting at the far left edge at 9:47. The counter was bare. He stood there. Then he continued to his office and closed the door and sat at his desk in the particular silence of a man who had just learned, too clearly and too late to pretend otherwise, exactly what absence felt like. The magnolia was coming back. Kaima stood at the window of room 4C and looked at it in the parking lot below, pale blooms just beginning to open along the lower branches, the kind of tentative early spring beauty that felt, under the circumstances, like a small cruelty. Her mother had been right about it. She was right about most things she chose to pay attention to, which had always been the things worth paying attention to, and never the things that might cause her to worry. "You're thinner," her mother said from the bed. "You're deflecting," Kaima said. Her mother smiled. It was still her smile, complete, unhurried, the kind that had always made rooms feel like they belonged to everyone in them. But it arrived more slowly now, as if it had to travel a greater distance to reach the surface. Kaima sat in the plastic chair beside the bed and looked at her mother's hands on the blanket, and felt the thing in her chest that had been pulled tight since Sunday pull a degree tighter and hold. She had prepared herself for this visit the way she prepared for everything, practically, systematically, with the part of her brain that processed difficulty as a sequence of manageable tasks. She knew the current medication protocol. She had reviewed the latest skin results with the oncologist that morning in a conversation conducted in the calm, clinical language she had learned to use when she needed information more than she needed to react to it. She had a notepad. She had written things down. What she had not prepared for was the specific quality of her mother's voice through the phone on Sunday versus the specific quality of her mother's voice in this room, and the distance between those two things, and what that distance measured. She sat in the plastic chair for a long time. Her mother slept in the afternoon, which was new, or not new, Kaima corrected herself, just new to her, a thing that had been happening in her absence in the months she had been 60 floors above Manhattan learning the temperature of another person's tea. She watched her mother sleep and did not reach for her phone or her notepad or any of the mechanisms she had developed for converting feeling into function. She simply sat. Outside, an orderly moved a cart down the corridor with a rhythmic squeaking wheel. A monitor beeped somewhere down the hall in a pattern that eventually became indistinguishable from silence. She realized, somewhere in the long quiet of that afternoon, that she had not cried since October. She turned this over with some surprise. Not because she had been happy, she understood her own interior well enough to know that happiness had not been the prevailing condition, but because she had not registered the absence of tears until now, had been so thoroughly organized around functioning that she had apparently outsourced her grief to a later date without consulting herself about it. The nursing program. The diagnosis. The storage unit key in a desk drawer 60 flights up. Derek leaving. Her mother's voice on Sunday. 8 months of things that warranted crying, and she had filed them all under later with the efficient ruthlessness of a woman who could not afford the present tense. Her mother's hand was warm when she took it. Small. The particular smallness again, not dramatic, just incremental, the kind of change that accumulates in the space between visits until it becomes undeniable. Kaima held her mother's hand and looked at the magnolia and quietly, without announcement, let later arrive. In Manhattan, the penthouse ran correctly. The contingency staff arrived on schedule and executed their duties with competence. The kitchen was clean. The morning brief appeared as expected. His tea was the right temperature, which he confirmed by lifting the cup and drinking without registering whether it was or not, because the temperature of the tea was not, it turned out, something he had ever cared about independently of the person who had learned it. He identified the problem on day 2. Everything was correct. The penthouse was exactly as it should be, maintained to the standard he had always required, and it felt, in a way he could not operationalize or resolve, entirely wrong. Not deficient. Not disordered. Simply wrong, in the manner of a room where the light source has shifted, same room, same contents, something fundamentally altered in the quality of the air. He worked. He took his calls. He made 3 decisions about the Chicago situation that his second described as characteristically decisive, which was a professional compliment and also, Woo-Jin understood privately, not quite accurate. The decisions were correct, but they were not made with his usual quality of attention. His usual quality of attention was elsewhere, which was a fact he acknowledged once, and then declined to revisit. On the 4th evening he walked down the West Wing hallway for no reason he was willing to name, and stood in the open doorway of her quarters. The room was exactly as she had left it, bed made with her particular precision, the small framed photograph on the nightstand facing the window, the desk drawer closed. The north-facing window held the city in its frame, gray-blue in the late evening light. He stood there for approximately 40 seconds. Then he walked back to the living room and poured 2 fingers of whiskey and set it on the side table and sat in the leather chair and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass for a long time. He did not drink it. He was still sitting there at 11. The whiskey was room temperature. Somewhere in Savannah, he knew from the tracking detail he had quietly maintained on her travel for reasons he had framed as security protocol and was finding increasingly difficult to frame as anything other than what it was. Kaima was in a hospital room. He picked up his phone. Set it down. Picked it up again and looked at her contact, listed still between the dry cleaner and building maintenance, and understood that this was no longer an accurate description of where she was located. He did not change it. Not yet. But he sat with the whiskey until midnight, and the city did what cities do, and somewhere below all of it, without his permission and beyond his considerable ability to prevent it, something he had built over 12 years continued, quietly and with gathering certainty, to come apart. She came back on a Sunday evening with the same 2 suitcases and less of something that did not have a clean name. Woo-Jin was in the living room when the elevator chimed, present by coincidence, or by something he had stopped bothering to call coincidence. After the 3rd evening he had found himself in the vicinity of the foyer between 8 and 9 p.m. He had a document open on his laptop. He had been reading the same paragraph for 11 minutes. The elevator doors opened and Kaima stepped through with her suitcases, and he understood immediately that Savannah had changed something, because she was composed. She was always composed. That was not the change, but the composition was different. Denser somehow. The way certain materials become denser under sustained pressure, not weaker but more concentrated, carrying more weight per surface than they appeared to from a distance. She met his eyes in the way she always did, directly, without performance, and said, "Good evening." And he said, "Welcome back." And both of these things were true, and neither of them was the thing either of them might have said under different conditions, which were conditions that did not yet exist between them, and which Woo-Jin was no longer pretending, strictly to himself, were conditions he had no interest in. "How is your mother?" he said. It was not quite a question, the construction of it too careful for that, the phrasing of a man trying to ask something real in the only register he had fluently available. Kaima looked at him for a moment. Something in the directness of the question seemed to find the thing she was carrying and press on it, gently and precisely, in the manner of a clinical assessment. "She's smaller," she said. "But she's still herself." A pause. "That's what matters." He nodded once. She picked up her suitcases and walked toward the West Wing, and he watched her go with the documents still open on his laptop and the paragraphs still unread, and did not return to either for the remainder of the evening. The message arrived at 11:47. His encrypted phone lived in the top left drawer of his desk and received a specific category of communication, the kind that did not travel through ordinary channels because ordinary channels were permeable, and the people who contacted him on this line understood that permeability was a liability they shared. He had not heard from Park Dae-hyun in 6 weeks, which was not silence so much as a held breath. Dae-hyun operated in the spaces between moves, patient and acquisitive, with the long strategic vision of someone who had learned that the most effective pressure was the kind you didn't feel until it had already done its work. Woo-Jin opened the message. A single photograph. High resolution, taken from a distance with equipment that was not inexpensive, the kind of image that communicated capability as much as content. Kaima outside the hospital entrance in Savannah. 4 days ago, he calculated from the quality of the light, which meant within 48 hours of her arrival. Her face in 3/4 profile, caught mid-step, expression private and unguarded in the way faces are when no one is watching. The jade bracelet on her wrist was visible with the specific clarity of a detail that had been noticed and chosen deliberately to be visible. Beneath the photograph, one line in Korean. "We know which door is unlocked." He read it. He set the phone down on the desk with a precision that required more control than it should have, and sat for a moment in the blue-lit silence of the East Wing, and did what he did with all incoming threats. He assessed it. Source, capability, intent, optimal response. He moved through these categories with the trained efficiency of 12 years, arriving at each conclusion cleanly, without obstruction. The assessment was complete in 4 minutes. The response would be measured, strategic, and initiated before morning. None of that was the problem. The problem arrived after the assessment, in the space where professional calculation ended and something else began, something that did not respond to the vocabulary of strategy because it did not live in that register. He picked up the phone and looked at the photograph again. Kaima mid-step, 3/4 profile, the magnolia just visible at the left edge of the frame. Someone had stood outside that hospital for a sustained period with professional equipment, and waited for the right moment, which meant they had known she was there, which meant they had been watching him closely enough and long enough to know that she existed in a category beyond household staff. Dae-hyun had read him. Had looked at the operational surface of Woo-Jin Oh, the tea at the correct temperature, the second cup at the far end of the counter, the bracelet framed as a bonus, the week's absence that had rearranged the quality of air in an entire penthouse, and had read it with the accurate, unsentimental clarity of a professional who understood that every man, regardless of the architecture he builds around himself, has a door. "We know which door is unlocked." Woo-Jin stood. He moved to the window and looked at the city with his hands in his pockets and felt, beneath the operational response that was already organizing itself with characteristic efficiency, the thing he had been constructing elaborate justifications to avoid since the 3rd month, maybe the 2nd. It was not a revelation. Revelations implied surprise. This was more like a confirmation, a thing he had known for long enough that its acknowledgement carried less shock than exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding a position for longer than the position warranted. She was not a liability to be protected. She was someone he could not afford to lose, which was different, and worse, and the most honest thought he had permitted himself in 12 years. He returned to his desk. He opened a second encrypted line and made 2 calls in Korean, his voice level and specific, the voice that moved people to action without requiring the reason to be explained. The calls lasted 9 minutes combined. Then he pulled up her contact on his phone. Still between the dry cleaner and building maintenance. He looked at it for a moment. He did not move it. He was not ready for what moving it meant. But he stayed at his desk until 2 in the morning, building the architecture of her protection with the same absolute focus he had once reserved only for things that were irreplaceable, because that was, he finally understood, exactly what she was. He told her on Monday morning. Not immediately. The day had its ordinary shape first, her brief on the counter, his tea at the correct temperature, the particular quality of resumed routine that follows an absence, careful and slightly deliberate, like re-entering a room after a long time and relearning where everything is. She moved through the penthouse with her usual economy, and he watched the morning pass from his desk with the patience of a man who had decided what needed to be said and was determining how to say it accurately. At 10 he came to the kitchen and stood at the island and waited until she turned from the window. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "Sit down." She sat. She did it without the hesitation most people brought to that instruction when it came in that register, the register that meant the information would be uncomfortable. She simply sat and folded her hands on the counter and looked at him with the level attention he had come to understand was not detachment, but its opposite, complete, unhurried presence. He told her about Daehyun. The rival faction, the territorial ambition, the 6 weeks of hell-breath silence that had ended Sunday night with an encrypted message. He told her about the photograph, where it was taken, when, what was visible in it. He described the line beneath it in Korean and translated it without softening the translation, because she was not a person who benefited from softened translations, and he had understood that since approximately the 3rd week. He told her about the security measures already in place, the detail on the building, the protocols he had activated, the timeline he anticipated for resolution. He told her that she was not in immediate physical danger but that the threat was real and that he would not pretend otherwise. He did not tell her about the specialist. When he finished she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was processing rather than waiting. Outside, the city moved through its late morning machinery, indifferent and continuous. "The bracelet," she said finally. "He saw the bracelet in the photograph." "Yes." "Which means he'd been watching long enough to know it was specific." She said it without accusation. It was an assessment, the same clinical plainness she brought to everything. "He wasn't watching me. He was watching you, and I was what he found." "Yes." She nodded once. Something moved behind her eyes that she did not bring to the surface. "What do you need from me?" It was, he thought, a characteristic question, practical, forward-facing, the question of a woman who converted difficulty into action as a matter of long habit. He told her what he needed: predictable patterns, no unnecessary exposure, immediate contact if anything felt irregular. She listened and confirmed each point with the focused attention of someone who intended to execute exactly what she agreed to. She did not ask the question he had been expecting, which was the question about what exactly his business was and what exactly this faction wanted, and what exactly resolution looked like. He was not certain whether this restraint was trust or self-protection or simply the recognition that some information changed the nature of the room you were standing in, and she was not yet certain she was ready for that room. He respected it. He let her go. The billing discrepancy was in a Monday afternoon email forwarded in error by the specialist's administrative coordinator, a junior staff member who had the correct patient name but the wrong household contact, and who had been sending quarterly expense summaries to the penthouse's general household account for 3 months without anyone noticing except, on this particular Monday, Kaima, who managed the household account and reviewed it with the regularity she brought to all administrative tasks. She looked at the line item for a long time. The specialist's name. Her mother's name. A Savannah billing address. 3 months of payments at a figure that was not small. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She read it again in case she had misread it, which she had not. She found him at his desk in the East Wing corridor, outside it, technically, as she had always remained, but close enough. She knocked on the door frame. He looked up. She held up her phone, the email open on the screen. He looked at it. He did not change his expression in the way a man changes his expression when he has been caught in something and is deciding how to manage it. He simply looked at it, and then looked at her. "You've been paying for my mother's specialist," she said. "Yes." The single syllable landed in the quiet between them and did not move. "For 3 months." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face was moving through a sequence she was not fully controlling, which was rare enough that she was aware of it, and the awareness made it harder to stop. "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" He was quiet long enough that she understood he was not constructing an answer so much as locating one, finding the accurate thing in the place where accurate things lived, beneath the operational language and the professional distance, and the 12 years of architecture built specifically to prevent this kind of exposure. "Because losing you," he said, "would be the first thing in 12 years that I couldn't absorb." The room held the sentence. Kaima stood in the doorway with her phone in her hand and felt the 8 months, all of it, the bracelet framed as a bonus, the second cup of tea either of them acknowledged, the window at 6:15, the untouched whiskey, the contact listed between the dry cleaner and building maintenance, rearrange itself around this sentence like iron filings around a pole, finding the shape they had been describing all along. She had spent 8 months making herself small enough not to need anything. He had spent 8 months quietly ensuring that she had it anyway. She looked at him across the threshold of the room she was not permitted to enter, and said the only thing that was true. "You should have told me." "I know. I'm not something you protect without my knowledge." Her voice was steady and certain and carried no anger, only the particular clarity of a woman reclaiming the terms of her own story. "I'm not a liability you manage." "No," he said. "You're not." He held her gaze with the unguarded directness of someone who had run out of the distance required to look away. "You are the only person in this building who has ever put something on my counter without needing me to acknowledge it. Who has learned my silences and not tried to fill them. Who has treated this place." He stopped. "Who has made this place into something it was not before." She stood with this. "I am not skilled at this," he said, which was the most unguarded sentence she had ever heard from him, spoken with the plain honesty of someone laying down something heavy they had been carrying for a considerable distance. "I know," she said. Either of them moved. The city held its breath beyond the glass. "The specialist stays," she said finally, quietly. "But you tell me. Whatever concerns my mother, whatever concerns me, you tell me." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a request." "Understood," he said. And the word, which she had heard from him once before on the first day in the foyer, formal, closing, a door being shut, sounded, this time, entirely different. Like a door opening. Dae-hyun's undoing was not dramatic. This was, Woo-Jin had always understood, the nature of the most effective resolutions. They did not announce themselves. They arrived in the form of a financial audit requested by 3 of Dae-hyun's own primary suppliers, who had received, through channels that were untraceable to any single source, documentation of certain accounting irregularities that called into question the long-term solvency of the operation they had been trusting with significant exposure. The documentation was accurate. Woo-Jin had not fabricated anything, because fabrication created vulnerabilities and accuracy, strategically deployed, was permanent in a way that spectacle never was. Within 10 days, 2 of Dae-hyun's senior men had begun separate conversations with separate parties about the structure of the organization after a leadership transition. Within 3 weeks, Dae-hyun himself was engaged in the specific kind of internal crisis that left no bandwidth for external pressure campaigns. Park Sun-il delivered the final assessment on a Thursday morning in 2 sentences. It was over, and it had been handled cleanly. Woo-Jin thanked him and ended the call and sat for a moment in the east wing with the encrypted phone on the desk beside him and felt the particular stillness of a resolved threat, the absence of a weight he had been carrying at low-grade intensity for months, the way you only fully register how cold you have been when warmth finally arrives. He told Kaima that afternoon. Briefly, accurately, as he had agreed to tell her things. The threat was neutralized. The building detail would stand down by the weekend. She listened in the manner she listened to everything, completely, without interruption, and then said, "Good," in a tone that carried more than the word, and returned to what she had been doing. She did not pack. He had not expected her to, but the confirmation of it settled something in him he had not consciously been holding open. The penthouse resumed its ordinary rhythm, which was not the rhythm it had before she arrived, and which he no longer had any interest in pretending was a neutral observation. He found her at midnight on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later. He had been working late, a contract review that required his specific attention, the kind of careful reading that he preferred in the quiet hours when the city had settled into its lower register and the penthouse was still. He came through the kitchen for water and stopped in the doorway. Kaima sat at the kitchen island in the lamp's small circle of light. She was in a gray sweatshirt, hair down, the jade bracelet on her wrist catching the light in the way it always did. In front of her, open and marked with colored tabs, was a textbook. Thick, clinical, familiar in the way of objects that have been carried a long time and set down and carried again. He read the spine from the doorway. Fundamentals of Nursing Practice. 4th edition. The cover had a worn crease along the left edge that spoke of previous use, previous study, a previous version of her that she had stored in a unit on 145th Street and apparently, at some point he had not been informed of, and did not need to have been informed of, retrieved. She looked up when she registered his presence. She did not appear embarrassed or explain herself, which was characteristic. She simply looked at him across the kitchen with the direct, unguarded quality that had been present between them since the doorway of the east wing, since the billing discrepancy, since the sentence that had rearranged the room. He crossed to the refrigerator and got his water. He stood for a moment with the glass in his hand, looking at the textbook and the colored tabs and her handwriting in the margins, small and precise. He went to his room. He came back 90 seconds later with his laptop and sat down across the island from her, opened a document he had been reviewing before the contract, and began to read. She watched him do this. He did not offer an explanation because none was necessary. He had sat across from difficult things his entire adult life and addressed them without announcement, and this woman with her nursing textbook at midnight, this reclamation made quietly and without consultation, this evidence of a future she had kept in storage and was now, apparently, rebuilding, was not a difficult thing. It was the least difficult thing in the penthouse. It was possibly the least difficult thing he had encountered in 12 years. They worked in parallel for 2 hours. The kitchen held its small circle of lamplight around them. Occasionally she turned a page. Occasionally he scrolled, or made a note in the margin of his document in the abbreviated shorthand he used when something required following up. Once she got up for water and set a glass beside his laptop without asking, and he drank it, and neither of them said anything. At 2 in the morning she closed the textbook, and pressed her palms flat against the cover for a moment in a gesture that was private and complete, the gesture of a person making a quiet agreement with themselves. She looked across at him. "I'm going back," she said, "to the program. I've spoken with the registrar. There's a re-enrollment window in September." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Mrs. Lim mentioned you'd called the registrar's office," he said, "last week. And you didn't say anything." "It wasn't mine to say." He held her gaze steadily. "It's yours." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the city held its nighttime register, low and continuous, the sound of things persisting. She did not move her hands from the textbook. He did not close his laptop. The distance across the island between them was small and neither of them crossed it, because some things do not require crossing, they simply require two people, sitting in the same light, no longer pretending that they have not already arrived. They stayed like that until she finally said good night and walked down the west wing hallway, and he listened to the sound of her door closing with the quiet of something settled, and opened the contact on his phone, still listed, for now, between the dry cleaner and building maintenance, and moved it, without ceremony and without hesitation, to the top. Where it belonged. Where it had belonged, if he was being honest, for considerably longer than he had been willing to admit. He closed his laptop. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed and slept, for the first time in 12 years, without the specific vigilance of a man who has decided he cannot afford to need anything. Something had been set down. Not a weapon, not a wall, not the careful architecture of a life designed to sustain no losses, just the pretending. Just the performance of a distance that had not, for a long time, actually existed. Outside, the city continued its indifferent turning. Inside, in the penthouse that had become something either of them had planned for and both of them had chosen, the silence held the particular quality of things that are exactly as they should be, built not from grand declarations or dramatic crossings but from 2 cups of tea, a bracelet framed as a bonus, and 2 people sitting in lamplight at midnight, working in parallel, each one the reason the other stayed. You stayed until 2 in the morning with Woo-Jin and Kaima, in a kitchen full of everything that was never said out loud. That means something. Not every viewer makes it to the quiet endings, the ones that don't shout, the ones that simply settle. So thank you? Genuinely. If this story found something in you worth finding, let me know in the comments, where you're watching from, which moment stayed with you, what you felt when he moved her contact to the top of his phone. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit the like button so more people find their way to stories like this one. Share it with someone who understands that the best love stories are built in silences, not speeches. I'll see you in the next one.